war started, they had the largest cyclotron in the world there, and threw them all in Tokyo Bay. You may not remember that, but that was a big story. We suddenly realized, wait a minute, they did a lot more than we. And then we started looking at Korea, where their plants were, and by the Korean War, there were actual. And I have all the orders and so on. Actual missions by bombers to bomb and destroy what had become the Russian nuclear plants built on what they had taken from Japan. And this is all documented. It's all there. So we didn't know about it. We found out about it. And then there are other smaller stories, many of them indicating that had all happened. And this general who finally got in touch with me and was instrumental in having the book published, he has located some workers around Konan, Korea, who remember this. I don't have those, and my book's already published. I can't get that in there, but it's just part of the continuing story. So I cannot tell you how big the bomb was. All I can tell you is there are numerous reports that it happened.
And believe it or not, my audience is interested in historiography and sources and how history gets made. How were you able to learn about this? Were there archives that had been closed off for a few decades after the war that opened, and you were able to see this, or?
You're a historian, and you will very much understand this. I read about the fact in the New York Times. I'm just a writer. I look for good stories. I had written my first book. I've written 12 now. I had written my first book. I was looking for another book, and I read on the front page of the New York Times that there was the possibility that Japan had tried to make an atomic bomb. I don't remember even right now what it was, but I really, that said to me, wow, that's a big book, that nobody knows this. And, oh yeah, it had to do with a Spanish agent who had worked for the Japanese. His name was Velasco. And anyway, he had said this and some other thing. There was some other stuff. So I just picked up the phone. I don't remember how I got a hold of this, but I got a hold of one of the big Yale professors of history, I called him up, and I'll give you his name in a second. It's terrible that I can't remember it right now, but I called him up and I said, "Is there anything to do with this?" Actually, I went to see him, Derek DeSola Price, Yale Avalon professor of the history of science. And I went to visit him, and he said, something big happened, and it's all been covered up. And he said, we have tried, meaning he and some of his assistants have tried, and we're just running into a stone wall. But if you go to Japan, you might find out more about it. Well, I did that. I was in good situation at that time, and I got an advance from Dial Press, and I went to Japan, and I literally talked to everybody. It turned out that Yashio Nishina is sort of the father of physics in Japan. It doesn't turn out, that's the way it was. And Nishina had been the head of the Army program, and he had early on been brought in and basically to do a pilot program. And, the Army and the Navy were very much at odds with each other in Japan. It has to do with their culture and everything else, and they didn't even talk to each other. But simultaneously, another noted physicist named Bunsako Arakatsu, he was brought in by the Navy. And so they have these two programs going on, one by Nishina and one by Arakatsu. The Nishina program is the one that most people have heard about, or at least if you dig into this, you find out it. And Nishina was very, very well regarded, and he was a great friend of Niels Bohr, and they used to talk to each other until the war started. And anyway, I went to Japan. I interviewed people who were involved in this. The guy who built all of the huge industry in Korea. He was dead, but Jun Noguchi was his name. But he was one of the Zaibatsu, like Mitsubishi and all the rest of them. But he was a self-made guy, and he did it by going over to Korea and starting a huge industrial complex there. And he had heavy water plants there before the war started, and eventually, and I will never forget sitting in Nishina's. It's sort of a shrine now. The Rikan is a huge area. I mean, acres and acres and acres, 1,000 acres, and it has all kinds of stuff on it. But this is where it all began. And I went to his office and his secretary, and she set up some meetings with some of Nishina's physicist assistants who worked on the bomb with him. And I remember a guy, his name was Tamaki, and he's a big physicist. I don't think he's alive now. This was like 30, 40 years ago. And I remember Tamaki saying to me, well, when we were working on the physics of it, which we easily did, it was well known, and we figured this out. The problem was going to be we would need a great industrial power, and they said to us, "Don't worry, Noguchi will take care of that." And subsequently, after interviewing, I would say 25 people involved with the program, I was able to write my first edition of this, which was published by Morrow. And there was much to be learned at that time. And 10 years later, it was republished by Marlowe in 1995. And I went back, and you asked me about did I find any secret documents. Well, boy, oh boy. I went to the National Archives this was in 1985, and I was able to find an area of the archives that was marked off, and what it was boxes of things, of documents that have not yet been read or classified. And so I had a friend there who had helped me with something earlier that I had, and he was quite a legendary archivist there, and he was able to get me in to begin to look through these boxes, and the boxes were like, these are from the occupation in Tokyo. These are from they were sufficiently labeled so that I didn't have to go through all 300 boxes, but I could start picking out things. And that's when I'll never forget it, I started looking maybe for 3 or 4 days, not much luck, and then I pulled out this report by that David Snell, that CIC agent who talked about that they had fired off this bomb. And that was the beginning. And from there, I was able to get into top secret CIA documents from the war, from the Korean War and between World War II and the Korean War. And I mean, it was just a hunting expedition. It was find a needle in a haystack. You would go, but slowly you began to get names, you began to get times, you began to get units, and you could go places, and lo and behold, it began to click together. And that's how the story came out, and both going to Japan and the National Archives.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. One other factor with this, you mentioned a little bit about spies from the Soviet Union infiltrating the Manhattan Project. I think his name was George Koval from the United States, who spied on the Manhattan Project for the Soviet Union. Another spy in Japan, Richard Sorge, who was German, but spied also for the Soviets and didn't speak great Japanese, but he was at the German embassy and had a lot of friends there and would find intelligence and send it back to Russia. As far as you know, were there any spies who infiltrated the Japanese atomic program? I could see how that would be a little bit more complicated. Or maybe they did. I don't know.
Great question. You see, that first article that I saw, that one in the New York Times, the thing that got me onto this in the first place, it was about a guy named Alcázar de Velasco. And by the way, I know of those spies you just spoke for. They were very important spies. His name was Alcázar de Velasco, and he was a Falange, working for Franco during the Civil War, and a very, very tough fascist type guy and a spy, and very flamboyant, ex-bullfighter and that kind of things. And the story, one of the stories that I dug up early was that he said he worked for the Japanese and actually spied on our Los Alamos. And he did so by coming through Mexico on a submarine. And when you check all this out, that was going on big time. There were lots of Japanese spies down in Mexico when the war started and throughout the war. And he was in the book. You will read that I went to Spain and I interviewed him, and he told me, "Oh yes, I went to Mexico. The Japanese hired me. They did so through their German contacts because he was working for he loved the Germans and was working for the Germans, and they sent him to Mexico." He went there, and he was to, and I can't remember right now, but he sends two Mexicans into the area where Los Alamos is, and they come back, and he has the Japanese meet him in Mexico. This is like 42, 43. And he remembers how they were sort of afraid to get near the guys. They were supposed to bring back materials. And this all goes along with the fact that there's no question that the Japanese knew we were working on an atomic bomb. Tojo calls his one of the big generals involved in the program, Kawashima, in 43 and says, things are going bad for us. We're going to have to develop the bomb. The Americans are working on it, and we have to develop one first because we're losing the war. And you have to realize that the Russians, who had spies all over the world, Korea was right next to them. They border Korea up at the top. There's a little small border of Russia. They knew exactly what was going on in Korea, and their spies. I mean, they had great spies, as you mentioned, Sergei and the other guy. I wasn't too familiar with him, but they had spies through the communist network in our program, several of them, big ones. The two who were executed. I forget their names now, but spying was really well done by the Russians, and they knew about what was going on, and that's why. That is the main reason they came in at the end of the war. They stayed out of the war. They were smart. They stayed out of the war, but at the very end of the war, they realized, hey, there's an atomic plant down in Korea. We're going to take that. So they came in and they sealed it off, and they stole everything they could, and then gave the rest to the North Koreans.
And I'd like to hear your take on the afterlife of Japan's nuclear program. I think you mentioned earlier that the United States got access to some cyclotrons, and then Russia found this facility in North Korea, stripped it down to its bones. How did that affect the United States and Russia? And then also you mentioned that North Korea develops a program, and so how are they able to do this? With what sounds like a stripped bare facility?
Yeah, well, it wasn't stripped bare, apparently, but whatever was left was taken over by North Korea, and that was the beginning of their nuclear program. They were a fledgling nothing nation in 1948. They had nothing, but they did have that area where Japan had